My brother and I both carry a gene for a rare neurological condition. He uses my episodes to make me look insane to our lawyers, only for me to find out he's been drugging my tea to mimic the symptoms he doesn't actually have. The fine china teacup shattered against the hardwood floor, sending a spray of lukewarm Earl Grey across the toes of my mahogany brown loafers. I didn't even feel it slip. My hand simply ceased to be mine for a heartbeat, a sudden violent tremor jerking my wrist as if an invisible wire had been pulled. I looked up, my tongue feeling like a thick dry piece of velvet in my mouth, unable to find the words to apologize to the 3 men in charcoal suits sitting across from me. We were in the grand library of Blackwood Manor, surrounded by the scent of old leather and the crushing weight of my parents' unread books. The legal battle for the estate hadn't even officially begun, and I was already falling apart in front of the people who held my future in their hands. The inheritance was a sprawling monster of land, stocks and history, but it came with a shadow. Our family carried a rare neurological glitch, a genetic gift that supposedly slept in our DNA until it decided to wake up and scramble the brain signals. My father had it. My grandfather had it. And now, as the primary heir, it seemed the curse had finally come for me. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. I could feel the vulnerability radiating off me, a physical heat that made the room spin. I was supposed to be the stable one, the protector of the family legacy, but standing there with tea soaking into the rug, I felt like a fragile porcelain doll with a hairline fracture running through its center. I'm so sorry, I finally managed to croak out, the syllables tripping over each other. My voice sounded foreign, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Mr. Sterling, the senior partner of the law firm, exchanged a look with his junior associate. It wasn't a look of anger. It was that devastating, soft-edged pity that makes you want to crawl into the floorboards. Before I could reach for a napkin, a firm, warm hand settled on my shoulder. It was my brother, Julian. He always smelled of cedarwood and expensive soap, a scent that usually brought me comfort. He stepped forward with a practiced, somber grace, his face a mask of weary brotherly love. "Please, gentlemen, forgive her," Julian said, his voice a smooth, comforting baritone. He knelt to pick up the larger shards of porcelain, his movements fluid and perfectly controlled, the polar opposite of my own jagged clumsiness. The stress of the passing has been harder on her than she likes to admit. These episodes, they're becoming more frequent. I wanted to shout that this was the first time I'd ever dropped anything so significant, but the words wouldn't form. I just stood there swaying slightly, feeling like a liability in the very house I had lived in for 60 years. Julian looked up at me with eyes that seemed to brim with tears, but behind the moisture, there was a stillness that chilled me. He was painting a picture of my incompetence, and he was using the finest brushes. Once the lawyers left, the manor returned to its suffocating quiet. Julian didn't scold me. In fact, he was a saint. Every morning he was there at the foot of my bed with a silver tray. My brother Julian pours my tea with a smile, but every sip pulls the fog tighter around my brain. He was meticulous about my health, reminding me to take the supplements the doctors had prescribed, and he never left my side when I felt dizzy. But lately the dizziness was constant. It was a thick, gray mist that settled behind my eyes, making the familiar hallway seem like a labyrinth I couldn't navigate. He started correcting me in small ways. I would mention that I'd locked the front door and he would sigh, gently leading me to the foyer to show me the bolt was thrown wide. The worst incident happened on a Tuesday. I was sure I had spent the afternoon reading in the sunroom. Julian came in, smelling faintly of smoke, and asked why I had left the stove burner on under an empty kettle. "I didn't even go into the kitchen, Julian," I insisted, my voice trembling. He didn't argue. He just took my hands in his, mine shaking, his steady as a rock, and looked at me with a heartbreaking intensity. "Clara, I found you standing over it. You were staring at the flame, lost in thought. I had to turn it off for you. Don't you remember?" I searched my mind, clawing through the haze, and found nothing but a blank, terrifying void. My confidence didn't just break, it evaporated. If I couldn't trust my own eyes, what did I have left? I started to believe that the genetic curse wasn't just affecting my nerves. It was erasing my very soul. I was startled one afternoon by a frantic pounding on the heavy oak front door. It was Eleanor, my dearest friend since we were girls in pinafores. I stood at the top of the stairs, my legs feeling like lead, watching through the banister. Julian opened the door just a crack. I heard Eleanor's sharp, concerned voice asking why I hadn't answered her letters or picked up the phone for weeks. "She's not herself, Eleanor," my brother whispered, his back to me. "The doctors say the confusion is progressing. She's too tired to see anyone. It breaks her heart when she can't remember people's names, and I want to spare her that humiliation." Eleanor protested, but Julian was a wall of polite, firm resistance. He shut the door on her, and for a moment, I felt a spark of white-hot dread in my gut. I wasn't being cared for, I was being erased. The walls of the manor felt like they were leaning in, turning the grand estate into a very gilded, very comfortable prison. The doubt began to fester. I wanted to trust Julian, he was my baby brother, the one I had protected from bullies when we were children. But the instinct that had kept me sharp in business for decades was screaming from beneath the fog. Why did I only feel this bad after the tea? Why did my memories only fail when Julian was the witness? I tried to skip my morning pills once, hiding them under my tongue, but Julian stayed in the room, watching me with a strange, predatory patience until I swallowed. He was always there, a shadow in the hallway, a hand on my elbow, a voice in my ear telling me how sick I was. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, watching from the sidelines as he took over the management of the staff and the handling of the family accounts. The second legal consultation was held in the formal dining room, a space so cold we had to light the fireplace even in the spring. Mr. Sterling looked grimmer than before. Julian sat next to me, sliding a leather-bound notebook across the table. "I've been keeping a medical log," Julian explained, his voice thick with feigned exhaustion. "Every tremor, every lapse in memory, every outburst of irrational anger. I thought it was important for the legal record." I leaned over to look at the pages. There were dates and times I didn't recognize, descriptions of me screaming at the gardener or wandering the halls at midnight. It was a work of fiction, a perfectly structured narrative of a woman losing her mind. I looked at the lawyers and I saw the noose tightening. The conversation shifted from inheritance to protection. They began to use words like conservatorship and legal guardian. They talked about me as if I were a piece of furniture that needed to be insured and locked away. Julian played his part to perfection, initially resisting the idea of taking total control, only to reluctantly agree that it was the only way to ensure the Blackwood legacy stayed intact. I sat there, my hands tucked under my thighs to hide the shaking that I couldn't stop, feeling the trap snap shut. I was being buried alive, and my own brother was the one holding the shovel, all while telling the world how much he loved the woman he was putting into the ground. The heavy silence of Blackwood Manor always felt more oppressive when I was alone, but today that silence was my only ally. I heard the low rumble of Julian's car fading down the long gravel driveway, signaling the start of one of his mysterious business trips to the city. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with the usual flutter of anxiety, but with a cold, sharp-edged intent. For weeks I had felt like a passenger in my own skin, watching the world through a thick graying veil. But this afternoon the fog seemed a fraction thinner. I made my way to the kitchen, my footsteps echoing on the cold checkered tiles. I wasn't looking for a snack. I was looking for the source of my own destruction. I began pulling open drawers I hadn't touched in months, moving past the polished silverware and the neatly folded linens. My hands were trembling, but for the first time I knew it wasn't the curse. It was adrenaline. I reached for a high shelf where a collection of decorative antique tins sat gathering dust, relics from our mother's time. As I reached, a sudden wave of vertigo made me stumble, and my elbow caught the edge of a small floral-patterned canister. It tumbled to the floor with a hollow thud, the lid popping off. I knelt down to gather the spilled contents, expecting old buttons or dried tea leaves, but what I found made the air leave my lungs. Scattered across the floor were dozens of small, unlabeled amber vials and a heavy stone mortar and pestle. I picked up the pestle, rubbing my thumb against a crust of fine, chalky white residue. I brought it to my nose and inhaled. It was faint but unmistakable, the same bitter, metallic undertone that had been hiding beneath the jasmine in my morning tea for months. The realization didn't hit me like a sudden shock. It was more like a slow, icy realization that froze my blood. He wasn't caring for me. He was manufacturing me. My own brother, the boy I had tucked into bed when our parents were away, was systematically erasing my mind with a sedative. I sat on the kitchen floor for a long time, staring at the white powder, feeling the decades of trust between us dissolve into nothing. But I couldn't scream and I couldn't run. Not yet. I needed to know how deep this went. I carefully put everything back, wiping the floor until not a single grain of the powder remained, and retreated to my bedroom to wait. The next morning the ritual began as it always did. I heard the soft click of the door and the rattling of the silver tray. Julian walked in, the morning light catching the silver strands in his hair, his face a picture of concerned devotion. "Good morning, Clara. You look a bit pale today. Drink up, it'll settle your nerves." I watched him set the cup down, his hands steady, his smile never reaching his eyes. I waited until he turned to adjust the curtains, and in one swift, silent motion, I tipped the contents of the cup into the large leafy fern sitting in the corner of my room. I brought the empty porcelain to my lips just as he turned back. "There," I whispered, putting on my best confused voice. "I feel so tired already, Julian." I climbed back into bed, pulling the duvet up to my chin and closing my eyes until they were just tiny, unnoticeable slits. I slowed my breathing, mimicking the heavy, drugged sleep I had inhabited for so long. For several minutes, there was nothing but the sound of the wind against the glass. Then I felt the bed shift. The concerned brother was gone. I felt his presence loom over me, cold and predatory. He didn't tuck me in. Instead, I heard his footsteps move toward my desk, the place where I kept my private journals and the keys to the family safe. I watched through my lashes as he began to leaf through my papers with a frantic, greedy energy, his face twisted in a sneer of contempt. He wasn't looking for my health, he was looking for my assets. He was waiting for me to disappear so he could step into my life. I knew then that I couldn't stay in the house a moment longer than necessary. 2 days later, under the guise of needing a long nap, I slipped out the back servant's entrance and caught a taxi to a private clinic 3 towns over. I sat in a sterile white waiting room, my name listed as a pseudonym, clutching my purse until my knuckles turned white. When the doctor finally called me in, a gray-haired man with a no-nonsense expression, he looked at my charts with a puzzled frown. "Ms. Smith, I've received your blood work. You have an alarmingly high concentration of a clinical-grade sedative in your system, enough to keep a grown man sedated for 24 hours. I felt a sob rise in my throat, but I choked it back. "And the neurological test? The genetic marker?" The doctor pulled off his glasses, looking at me with genuine sympathy. "That's the strange part. You carry the gene, yes, but in your case it is completely dormant. There is no biological reason for the tremors or the memory loss you've described. Physically speaking, your brain is as sharp as a woman half your age. You aren't sick, Clara. You're being poisoned." I walked out of that clinic feeling like I had been reborn. The fog was gone, replaced by a searing, white-hot clarity. But as I sat on the bus ride back, my mind began to piece together the other side of the puzzle. If I wasn't the one suffering, why was Julian so desperate? I began to replay the last few months in my head, looking past the mask he wore. I remembered the way he always kept his hands in his pockets during legal meetings. I remembered the small, flesh-colored bandages he wore on his fingertips to hide the telltale tremors of the family curse. I remembered his business trips, always coincided with the days the city's top neurological specialists held their clinics. Julian was the one who was truly fading. He was the one the gene had claimed, and he was using my inheritance to fund a desperate secret search for an experimental cure that cost more than a small country's budget. I needed proof of his endgame. I reached out to Arthur, a man who had been a junior clerk for our family lawyers before Julian had him fired for incompetence 2 years ago. We meet in a crowded public park, sitting on a bench near a noisy fountain where no one could overhear us. Arthur looked older, his coat frayed at the sleeves, but his eyes were sharp with a shared resentment. "I've been waiting for you to realize, Clara," he said, handing me a manila envelope. "Julian didn't just fire me. He bribed a secretary to get access to your father's final will. I saw the drafts he's been working on with a different firm. The second the court declares you incompetent and names him your conservator, he has a sale pending for Blackwood Manor and all the surrounding acreage. He's liquidating your life to save his own." I looked at the documents in the envelope. The dates were all set for the end of the month, the day after my next competency hearing. The betrayal was complete. He was going to strip me of my home, my name, and my freedom, all to pay for his own survival. I looked up at the trees, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, and felt a cold, hard knot of determination settle in my stomach. Julian thought he was playing a game with a woman who had lost her mind. He didn't realize he was playing a game with a woman who had finally found her purpose. He wanted to use the curse to bury me? Fine. I would make sure that by the time this was over, he was the one trapped in the darkness he had created. I walked back into the house that evening, the weight of the manila envelope from Arthur tucked tightly against my side like a hidden blade. The air in the foyer was stagnant, smelling of wax polish and the faint, bitter ghost of jasmine. Julian was waiting in the parlor, sitting in our father's high-backed wing chair, silhouetted by the dying embers in the fireplace. He didn't look up, but I saw his fingers twitching rhythmically against the velvet upholstery, a telltale sign that his real condition was worsening. I didn't say a word about the clinic, the doctor, or the secret sale of my home. Instead, I let my shoulders slump and my eyes go dull, affecting the vacant stare of a woman who had finally surrendered to the fog. The morning of the competency hearing arrived with a cold, gray light that bled through the heavy velvet curtains. This was the day Julian had planned for months. The day the court-appointed attorneys would finalize the paperwork to strip me of my agency. I stood in the kitchen early, long before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. My hands were perfectly steady as I reached for the floral tin on the high shelf. I pulled out the mortar and pestle, feeling a grim sense of irony as I ground the white tablets into a fine, silent dust. Julian's silver tray was waiting on the counter. Usually he was the one who served me, but today I brought the tray to his study. "I thought I'd return the favor, Julian," I murmured, my voice intentionally soft and slightly slurred. "A final thank you for taking such good care of me." I placed 2 identical cups of tea on his desk. He looked at me, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, followed by a smug, condescending warmth. He watched me carefully as I took a long, theatrical sip from my cup, the one I had left pure. Confident that the predator was still in control, he picked up his own cup and drank deeply, sighing with satisfaction. He didn't notice the slight grit at the bottom, nor did he realize that I had doubled the dose he usually gave me. I wanted him to feel every ounce of the confusion he had forced upon me, layered on top of the real illness he was so desperately trying to hide. By the time the 3 lawyers and the court representative arrived an hour later, the trap was already snapping shut. We gathered in the grand library, the same room where I had shattered the teacup weeks before. Julian sat at the head of the table, but he looked different. His face was flushed, and a thin sheen of sweat had broken out across his forehead. He went to open the legal folder, but his fingers fumbled with the clasp, his tremors so violent that the papers rattled like dry leaves in a storm. He tried to speak, to offer the opening remarks about my unfortunate decline, but the words came out as a thick, unintelligible mumble. I didn't wait for him to recover. I stood up, my posture straight, my gaze piercing and direct. I looked at Mr. Sterling, the senior attorney, and spoke with a clarity that silenced the room. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming. I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding regarding who exactly is in need of a conservator in this house." I watched Julian's eyes widen. He tried to stand, his face contorting with a mixture of rage and drug-induced panic, but his knees buckled. He collapsed back into the chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The lawyers stared at him, then at me, their faces transitioning from pity to utter bewilderment. "Julian has been very thorough in his medical logs about my health," I continued, walking slowly toward my brother. I pulled the amber vials and the mortar and pestle from my pocket, placing them on the table with a sharp clack. But he neglected to mention that these were the primary ingredients in my morning tea. He also forgot to share the results of my private blood tests from 2 days ago, which show a toxic level of these sedatives in my system. I slid the lab reports across the polished wood. Julian reached for them, but his hand swung wide, knocking a heavy crystal inkwell onto the floor. He let out a low, guttural groan, his head lolling to the side as the double dose of his own medicine began to override his motor functions. The scene was devastating. The caring brother was now the one slurring, shaking, and appearing utterly detached from reality. I described the hidden bandages on his fingers, explaining how he had been faking my symptoms to cover his own very real neurological decay. "He didn't want my help," I told the attorneys, my voice tight with a grief that was entirely real. "He wanted my money. He wanted to sell this estate to fund experimental treatments for the condition he's currently manifesting right in front of you." Mr. Sterling picked up the vials, his expression turning to stone as he looked at the label-less glass. He looked at Julian, who was now weeping silently, unable to form a coherent sentence to defend himself. The legal collapse was swift and absolute. The court representative immediately halted the proceedings for my conservatorship. Within 30 minutes, the senior partner had called for a private ambulance and the local authorities. The documents Julian had painstakingly prepared to sell Blackwood Manor were gathered up not as contracts, but as evidence of fraud and attempted elder abuse. I watched from the window as the black car of the family law firm departed, replaced by the flashing lights of an ambulance. Julian didn't fight them. He couldn't. He was led out of the house he tried to steal, leaning heavily on two medics, looking like a broken, hollow version of the man who had poured my tea that morning. He wasn't taken to a cell. I knew the law well enough to know his medical state would preclude a standard trial for now. He was taken to a secure psychiatric and neurological facility, the very kind of place he had intended for me. There, his real decline would be monitored, but it would no longer be funded by my silence or my blood. As the gates of the estate clicked shut behind the ambulance, the silence that returned to Blackwood Manor was different. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a prison. It was the quiet of a house that had finally been purged of a poison. That evening I took a chair out to the back porch. The air was crisp, tasting of the coming rain and the wild grass of the valley. I sat there for hours watching the shadows stretch across the lawn. The genetic curse still lived in my blood, dormant and quiet, but the fear of it no longer controlled me. I had lost the only family I had left, and the sting of Julian's betrayal would likely never fully fade. But as I breathed in the fresh, unclouded air, I felt a profound sense of reclamation. My mind was sharp, my home was secure, and my future was finally my own. I wasn't a victim of a family gene or a brother's greed. I was the master of Blackwood, and for the first time in my life I could see for miles.